The Indian diaspora is the largest diaspora in the world. Let's begin this by understanding the word diaspora, which is derived from the Greek verb diaspero, meaning I scatter or I spread about. Indian diaspora refers to the people of Indian birth or ancestry who live outside the Republic of India. Indian diaspora can be broadly divided into two groups: non-resident Indians or NRIs and persons of Indian origin or PIO. According to the Reserve Bank of India, a non-resident Indian is a person who is an Indian citizen but resides outside of India for a certain number of days determined by the Government of India. A person of Indian origin is a person resident outside of India and sharing Indian ancestry. Persons of Indian origin used to have the PIO card, but since 2005, the Government of India has discontinued the PIO card and now introduced the Overseas Citizenship of India card or the OCI card. The Constitution of India does not permit dual citizenship, but thanks to the persistent efforts of the Indian diaspora and the progressiveness of the Indian government, in 2005 the Government of India introduced the OCI card under the Citizenship Amendment Act 2005. The OCI card is effectively a long-term visa for persons of Indian origin, with restrictions on voting rights and holding government jobs. Now let's understand the geographical dispersion of the Indian diaspora. According to a Ministry of External Affairs report released by the Government of India, there are 32 million NRIs and PIOs residing outside India. India has the world's largest diaspora population with 18 million Indians or persons of Indian origin living outside their homeland in 1920. So where are the people of Indian origin settled abroad? According to Ministry of External Affairs, these are the top 25 countries in the world in which NRIs and persons of Indian origin reside and call their home. Moving on, let's understand the pattern of emigration of the Indian diaspora from India. This emigration of the Indian diaspora can be described in three eras. First, the ancient era migration. Second, the colonial era migration. And third, post-colonial era migration. The ancient era migration can be described from the period from 500 BC to 18th century AD. Indian migration in this ancient era was driven by trade, religion, and diplomacy. In ancient India, there was an extensive trade with the ports of the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and China. Indian spices and cloth were exported, and gold, ivory, spices, tin, Chinese blue pottery, and silver were imported. Going back to the 4th century to 6th century CE, India during the Gupta Empire was a land of riches, and people possessed great skills at weaving textiles, crafting gold jewelry, metal, sculptures, and creating beautiful objects. During this time and beyond, there was much demand for Indian goods. Many famous trading communities from India, such as the Bohras, the Baniyas, and the Chettiars, continued trading Indian commodities and valuables with foreign nations and found themselves settled abroad. Indian traders took residence in Arabia, East Africa, and Southeast Asia, and from there spread to the other countries of the region. Beyond commerce, religion also played a role in the emigration of the Indian diaspora. As in the case with Southeast Asia, Hindu priests and Buddhist monks accompanied the mercantile class and assumed a leading role in spreading the message of the Indian thought and culture to the entire Southeast Asian region. In ancient India, Indian diaspora also emigrated west for trading to Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. For instance, traders from Shikarpur town in current Pakistan, but then part of the Indian subcontinent, migrated and settled west in Central Asia. Indian trading community also made its way to Russia. In the early 18th century, a colony of 400 Indian merchants had established based in Astrakhan in southern Russia. Other emigrations were simply driven by necessity. In the 11th century AD, the Romani people from the northwest of India migrated westwards to Europe, perhaps driven by the invasion of the Afghan general Mahmud of Ghazni, or perhaps driven by drought. Next, let's move on to understand the Indian emigration in the colonial era from 18th century to 20th century AD. The British and French colonization of India from the 18th to the mid-20th century ushered in an era of renewed migration from India. From 1830s to 1920s, around 1 million indentured labor emigrated from North India and South India to European colonies and plantations all around the world. This resulted in the development of large Indian diaspora in the Caribbean, South Africa, East Africa, French Réunion Island, Mauritius, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Myanmar and Fiji. In these countries, a very unique and interesting culture evolved among the Indian diaspora. As times progressed in 18th and 19th century, Indians also emigrated as traders and government employees to the East and South African countries besides Fiji and South Africa. At the sunset of the colonial era and after World War II, new immigration from India moved primarily to Britain in the country's post-war drive to recruit labour from the Commonwealth to cover employment shortages in state-run services like the UK's National Health Service and London Transport. Let's move now to the 21st century to understand Indian diaspora migration in the post-colonial era. After independence from Britain in 1947, Indians began the third phase of migration, this one driven by their own free will. Indian diaspora that had migrated to Africa and Europe decades back as traders, as merchants, as workers, continued to prosper in these countries, especially in Britain, South Africa, Kenya, and Uganda. In some countries such as Ethiopia, Indian teachers found themselves in high demand and contributed to education and literacy of a growing nation. For example, between 1947 and 1991 in Ethiopia, 1 in 3 teachers in the country's secondary schools were Indians. The Indian diaspora also contributed to the growth of the Gulf nations. In the 1970s and 80s, driven by the oil boom and infrastructure expansion in Gulf countries, Indian diaspora established roots in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and Iraq. After World War II, as peace established in the world, and as Western countries in Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand expanded in economic prosperity and needed talent, Indian diaspora contributed to those. Indian diaspora migrated to these countries in the form of professionals, managers, entrepreneurs, and also students seeking higher education in the universities in these countries. For instance, from 1960s to 1980s, many Indian doctors migrated to the United States, UK, and other countries to contribute to the medical needs of a rising population in these countries. The 1990s and the early 2000s saw the rise of the great Indian IT industry and export of the Indian IT talent abroad that contributed to the globalization of the world and rise of the internet economy, of which we are part of today. As the world progresses in the 21st century, Indians and persons of Indian origin have emerged as CEOs, managers, media personalities, chefs, politicians, technocrats, scientists, entrepreneurs, writers, and film directors. The new Indian diaspora represents India's talent and soft power at the global stage. The Indian diaspora has contributed positively to the countries that they have adopted as home, but are equally in touch with their homeland. From 3,000 years old civilization to the 21st century globalized world, the philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means the world is one family, is the core belief of Indian thought and culture, and the global Indian diaspora has lived every word of this philosophy.